Indigenous have been on the front lines of ocean observation for thousands of years.
The best way to work in partnership is to have a respectful relationship with trust established between all partners.
And if Indigenous communities are empowered to do the work that they know needs to be done, we will have a better chance at fighting climate change.
Heard that? Truly inspiring. That's the kind of wisdom that makes you stop and think. And today, we're diving right into it. Welcome to this new episode of Surfacing Secrets from Ocean Networks Canada. Explore the ocean, know the planet. I'm your host, Lynn Morissette, marine biologist, science communicator, and someone who's spent a lifetime between whales, coastal communities, and the mysteries of the ocean. In this series, we uncovered the hidden stories of ONC, stories of curiosity, courage, and collaboration. Some are scientific, some are deeply human, but all remind us that the ocean is more than water. It's culture, it's knowledge, it's home. And today, a theme close to my heart, the power of Indigenous partnerships with ONC. How do respect, trust, and humility reshape the way we do ocean science? And what happens when traditional knowledge systems meet modern technology to protect our shared ocean? Our guests bring unique voices. Maya Huberex.
I'm Maya Huberex. I'm a first-generation Canadian of Dutch Indonesian heritage, and my role is with Ocean Networks Canada as the Associate Director of Learning and Community Engagement. So I lead a team that works with communities all around Canada, especially with Indigenous communities, to get ocean data into their hands and to see what we can do to help them advance their priorities for ocean science in their regions.
Peter Romer.
I'm Peter Romer, so Peter's my Frisian side, and Asamgan is my Niska'a side, so I'm from the Niska Nation of people of the Nass River. And I'm the Indigenous Community Liaison for Ocean Networks Canada, which means everything Indigenous comes through my desk eventually, and I get to connect all the amazing experts in our network with those nations. And really, I have the cool job of asking nations of how can I support you and in what capacity?
And Ken Paul.
My name is Ken Paul. I'm a member of the Wolastoqey Nation. My home community is located in Nagutguk, or otherwise known as Tobic First Nation in northern New Brunswick, in the Atlantic coast. I work independently on a number of different contracts, but all of the work that I do, I'm either supporting First Nation rights, specifically within fisheries. I work with a lot of scientists, a lot of academics. I work with industry groups and with a number of First Nations. And basically, what I'm trying to do is help to empower Indigenous communities. I'm working on with a lot of partners as well. And although I'm very, very busy because there's a lot of work to be done in this area, I also try to make sure that the community members that I work with also have an opportunity to work in this field.
Together, they're not just sharing projects, they are sharing lived experience, building bridges that change how we understand and care for the ocean. Every partnership has a beginning. For ONC, it started when Maya and her team were asked a simple but vital question. How will Indigenous community be part of this work?
ONC started formally engaging with Indigenous communities in 2013 and 2014. We received funding to install monitoring equipment at locations that might potentially see resource-related development in the coming years in BC, so specifically related to sites that were of interest for liquefied natural gas. So this was quite a controversial project to be attached to, but an important component of the funding we received was to engage with the Indigenous communities who would potentially be nearby these installations. So that was the beginning, and within ONC, I was already working with the learning and engagement team, and we were doing a lot of work around trying to make ocean science inclusive. And so it was a natural fit for me to start working on this challenging project of engaging these communities. So, now I'll do a super fast forward to how we do things now, just to build up a contrast. I would never go into a community with funding in hand and say, we have this project, what do you think of it? That is not the way to do things. But at the time, this was how it all started.
From day one, it wasn't an extra. ONC built roles inside the organization just to make sure partnerships were real, not symbolic.
Part of the funding we received was to hire 2 positions, one of which is the position that Peter now has, the Indigenous Community Liaison. And the other role that we created was the Indigenous Community Learning Coordinator. So that was really the beginning of having specific positions for Indigenous people, because we wanted to advance our partnerships with Indigenous communities.
Peter reminds us, Indigenous people have been ocean observers long before satellites. Thousands of years of data etched right into the shoreline.
Indigenous have been on the front lines of ocean observation since millennia. Here on the coast, just in BC alone, on Triquet Island, there was an archaeological study between UVic and Hakai, and they found 13,500-year-old footprints of sea lion hunters. So we've been observing for thousands of years on our coastlines. Around the world, there's 2,000 Indigenous communities just on the coast, representing over 27 million people, but they're the least engaged. And so really, like back in 2019, for me, the passion started at Ocean Obs 19 when we brought 53 Indigenous delegation, people from all around the Pacific as far as Saipan and Canada, together to speak on proper, meaningful Indigenous engagement and building true partnerships and what that meant. And 6 years ago, really, that people were still new to Indigenous engagement, and which is really surprising, since how late we are in the game when it comes to education around Indigenous communities. And what kind of sparked my passion around that to advocate for Indigenous was that I was asked to speak to a group of people. We were holding a town hall, and we had a bunch of presenters. We had a bunch of sessions, but I was asked to speak to Indigenous engagement at a reception of a group of scientists, and someone said, "Hey, Peter, I overheard what you were saying. Can you come and speak to my group?" And so I went to speak to that group with my Inuit friend, and that group of scientists didn't want to have anything to do with me. They turned their backs cold to me. It was extremely rude. I thought, oh, that's funny. So I tried again. Then they all turned their backs to me, and their friend was like, hey, guys, I'm trying to get you to listen to Peter. But I was about to have some choice words, but just kind of backed off. And I just realized that there was a lot of work to do in the ocean science community, and that there are old boys and girls clubs out there that still exist that they think they can not engage with Indigenous on the coastline. So this gave me a passion to advocate for Indigenous, not just in Canada, but worldwide. So I've been working with Indigenous communities for over 25 years. I'm an Indigenous filmmaker and had an Indigenous show that ran 14 years on CTV. So I built a lot of trust with these communities, and really, which takes a lot of just listening and understanding. So when I got the job at ONC, I already had relationships with these communities and a fairly good connections with different chiefs and different leaders around, and a pulse on just some of the struggles that our people face on the coast. I grew up as a commercial fisherman since I was 6 months old till I was 19. I lived on the boat full time and been through all these different fishing communities. So I understood the type of work they were doing in their communities already. So working with those nations, I was able to gain their trust, in various capacities. It really depends on what a nation is looking for, whether it's in education, is it in ocean monitoring, is it further in science?
Ken adds another angle. Years as a federal hydrographer taught him how the system works. Knowledge He now flips to help communities push for change.
Yeah, so I had a federal career for 20 years before I started working with First Nations chiefs. I did ocean mapping for 10 years. I had worked with Parks Canada for 10 years, including a stint up in the Northwest Territories in the high Arctic, working under comprehensive land claims. Really what that had done for me, not only exposed me to Indigenous peoples across Canada, but it let me understand like what the federal system is really all about. I know that people in our communities, when they look at federal governments, they just see it as government in general. They don't understand the divisions within the government, the responsibilities, and they really were trying to figure out how to develop the relationship with Canada from our community perspective. After I left the federal government back in 2012, I started working directly for First Nations chiefs, both regionally in Atlantic Canada as a fisheries director, but then nationally with the Assembly First Nations as the National Fisheries Director. And so when I'm on the other side of the ledger here, trying to advocate, I try to find ways that we can actually develop these partnerships, knowing some of the constraints that the federal partners are with. And through that exposure with the Assembly First Nations, this is where I met Maya and Peter, and I started working also with non-government organizations. And I really find that the NGOs in general are really sincere about working through these things. But again, they sort of face the same challenge of how do you make this work with under a federal system? So I would say that the exposure and the training and the networks that I had developed has really helped me, and it's helped shape like where I am doing my work today.
And then came a shockwave, the Marshall Decision. For the first time, treaty rights to fish were upheld. And as Ken recalls, no one was prepared for it.
There was, like, people weren't prepared. Like, the federal government was prepared, and quite frankly, our chiefs really weren't prepared either, because it was a bit of a surprise. Like, it was like the first time we kind of collectively won a major recognition.
That ruling flipped the script. New rights, new responsibilities, and a stronger voice in ocean decisions. And that, according to Maya, created the best team ever.
I am proud of it. Yeah. I have a really great team. Like, I think, we joke with the people that we hire that they've joined the most fun team at ONC. And I'm sure other people say that the same thing about their teams. And I encourage them to keep doing that. But, we have such a diverse team with people of different backgrounds. And regarding our relationships with Indigenous communities, we have 4 Indigenous members in our team. So something really crucial that we did early on is make sure that we had dedicated positions for Indigenous people in our organization. And that's really allowed ONC to advance our work on reconciliation and doing our work with Indigenous communities in a good way. And I've learned so much from our Indigenous staff members. I mean, they regularly tell me all the things I do wrong. I'm not Indigenous myself. So we're all on a learning journey all the time. And that's also, exciting and interesting in our work as well.
At ONC, it all comes down to one thing: building trust, one relationship at a time. And once that trust is there, you can start sharing what really matters: knowledge. The ocean speaks many languages. Some sound like gigabytes of data. Others live in stories and ceremonies. At ONC, they don't compete. They collaborate.
So I think, like, in my work with Indigenous communities, it's really emphasized to me that these multiple ways of knowing are really, really important for us to understand and make change in the world. And when we think about the urgency right now of climate change and the urgency of taking care of our ocean for our future, Indigenous people have been doing that for thousands of years successfully. And Western science has a lot of learning to do from those community knowledge holders on how to do that well. And it's really critical that we get all of the expertise at the table to make decisions we're at a critical point really in our path on this planet, I think, and Indigenous people can share a lot of wisdom about that.
So what do we mean by Indigenous knowledge? Not a snapshot of the past. It's a full system, values, place, and relationships guiding every decision.
The term traditional means in the past, and the knowledge only focuses on what you know. It doesn't really take into consideration like the whole value systems and everything else that are in place that inform that information. Some people also don't understand that traditional knowledge is actually localized knowledge. So what we know here and how we understand our natural ecosystems, our relationships with the flora and the fauna, that doesn't necessarily translate to other places because they have different ecosystems, they have different species, they have different traditions and cultures in that area. So it's something that's sort of like more like what you do and how you know things, rather than specifically that information of how do you do the specific thing. There's been a history of people coming into Indigenous communities, grabbing information, grabbing knowledge from them, and exploiting that knowledge. And in some cases, that information has been used against the communities. So this trust, this value of trust is really important. I've had one chief mention to me last year that when people come into his territory, they're coming in there to take something away. Areas where it seems to be changing are places like in Cape Breton, which is part of Mi'kmaq, where they have developed the CEPI partnership, which is the collaborative environmental partnership initiatives, where they, under the leadership of actually Charlie Dennis, who is a Mi'kmaq from Eskasoni, who has since passed in the spirit world, had brought people together and said that it doesn't really matter like what your job title is, or if you come from a federal department, a provincial department, an institution, a business. If you're there to talk about the health of the Bedore Lakes and works what is on the best interest of the fisheries, then we want to work with you. And because the Mi'kmaq communities had led this, they had naturally blended in this concept of Indigenous knowledge systems. And the term even Indigenous knowledge, like that's kind of a foreign concept in our communities. Like it's not a terminology that Native communities came up with. It was other people that have come up with it to describe like a methodology or a way of knowing. So this is why we like to refer to it as a system, because it's a whole other knowledge paradigm, as opposed to like a Western science paradigm, which you have a specific methodology. Mm-hmm. And the best way to work with these systems is to work with them at the beginning and try to find ways to integrate them together rather than having parallel processes. I know that up in the north, up in Nunavut, groups like Smart Ice, for example, are using this concept as well. The Inuit up there know where critical areas are. They're working with NGOs with territorial and federal governments to find out critical areas that are important to study to understand the impact of climate change, for example. So those are the kind of things that are really important. But a lot of the times, like this integrative work is not really widely known or celebrated. Sometimes they might be written up, but if you go into communities and ask the communities about if they've partnered in different kinds of projects, especially in the marine sector, they will explain to you like who are people that they've worked with, and they probably can help describe like why that partnership is actually working. So there's no formula for this per se, but it does really start with like building those foundational relationships of trust and co-developing the research questions together.
And Ken says it best. It's a knowledge system as structured and rigorous as science, just rooted in place instead of labs. And when he refers to it as a knowledge system, he means that if it's a system, there's a methodology behind it, just like the scientific method. And it's a way for us to elevate the importance of community knowledge, traditional knowledge systems, so they are part of managing fish and habitat. Okay, but how did that actually play out? Here's Maya walking us through what it looks like when a community comes with an idea and ONC gets to work alongside with them.
It is always great for us when a community comes to us and says, we have this need. For example, we're very interested in building up our program in acoustic monitoring. So this is something that we've heard. And we're concerned, for example, about increasing vessel traffic, and we want to be able to understand how that might be affecting marine mammals and other wildlife in our territories. So based on those initial conversations, whichever way that they start, we would look at where does Ocean Networks Canada have the ability to suggest maybe a monitoring system? How can we suggest collecting data to help advance this community's interest? It might be making recommendations or giving advice. It might be helping to procure equipment and install it. And then the follow-on too is, let's say that we do decide together that we want to have some kind of installation, for example, of one of our coastal community observatory systems. We would try to secure funding for that. And once we would have the funding, then we would go through the whole process of permitting, which also I will add that that's a formal process where we have to engage with Indigenous communities too, because there is a point in the process where input is sought from communities. So if the groundwork hasn't been correctly laid and you're going to try to go through a permit process for an installation, you won't be advancing with that. So, for ONC, we for sure do all of that work in the beginning to ensure that when we come to ask permission to start a project, we already know that the nations whose territory it would be operating in are supportive and hopefully more than supportive, hopefully also invested in the project and partners in the project and co-designing with us. That's the ideal. So anyway, then if we've gone through all of that, we have our permits in place and we actually start the monitoring program or install the equipment. Then the work starts to collect the data. So Ocean Networks Canada, using our both people power and our data management system, this is one of the core things we do, is collect, manage, and provide access to ocean data. And we also have our data teams who do both automated and manual quality control of the data. And we have systems that produce data products, so data presented in different ways that can be downloaded. And then I think something also that's a real strength of ONC that we've built over these many years is we have people whose role it is then to work with the communities to ensure that they can access the data and also to help in interpreting the data. We also work with teachers and students in formal and informal learning settings to try and, as much as we can, ensure that meaningful use can be made of all the data and information that's being collected.
Not every data set has the same weight. For Ken, the real measure of value comes from outside the lab.
That's smart. But I'm always trying to guard of how would this translate to communities? How would this benefit communities? Is there information that we can bring in? If there's opportunities to bring youth out there to see some of these things so that they can start learning, because we're trying to build for the next generations. And this is basic relationship stuff,
Sometimes the simplest step gets overlooked. The part where you actually meet as humans before anything else.
Be a people person first. We'll talk business later. And that goes so far, like, as you know, with anybody you meet in any of your engagements, in just a casual conversation, suddenly you learn so much from each other, and suddenly you learn, like you have some things in common, and then suddenly it's so much easier to talk business later, right? It's common sense, and it's just sometimes I find it odd that we still have to repeat these things of that mutual respect for one another.
Here's what surprises a lot of people. Even with all the tech ONC brings, it's never the starting point. The direction comes from somewhere else entirely.
Well, we really try to have a lot of our projects community-led, so it's really up to the nation to drive the bus. We're just there to really help with the tech and get those sensors in the water, and they really let us know. But a healthy, project usually starts from that budget up. So we're all on this pay for it for them, but it's a slow process depending on where that funding is coming from. In the past, there's been lots of parachuting in with a PowerPoint and saying, "Hey, this is the project," and then leaving and calling that consultation. Unfortunately, other parts of the world that's still happening, even in the U.S. And we consult a lot with our nations, with these different delegations that we're part of. We really hear out everybody from coast to coast. And, it's really about building a relationship first before we start talking business.
Here's something science doesn't always do well: taking the time up front. Maya explains why, before any project gets off the ground, the real investment has to be in people.
I think what's very different to the scientific working culture is that there needs to be a recognition that the time and the money to build those relationships needs to be invested before a project even starts or is proposed. So I think what is very unique about how we've been able to approach this is because we've invested in people and we've grown now our Indigenous engagement staff and also grown capacity in our organization among all our teams in having this mindset towards working that relationships are critically important. So because of that investment in people and time to do that work, Ocean Networks Canada is able to reach out to communities and travel to communities without necessarily having a specific project on the table, just with the objective of, let's see if we have something of interest that we might want to work on together. And let's hear from this community what their priorities are and if maybe there's a need that Ocean Networks Canada can fill. And I think once you figure that out, so if we hear from a community that there's something that's really of interest to them and they know about what Ocean Networks Canada can do, and they also have heard often through word of mouth about the work that we've done with other communities, then we might be in a place to start talking about, hey, let's submit a proposal together, or let's see if this funding could work, or maybe you could join this other project, or maybe we could introduce you to this scientist at a university who's doing something similar. I do think it's changed quite a lot since the beginning, but it is a culture change in science to recognize that that's a very important part of the work. It's not, a sideline to the work or a delay to the work. It's part of the work that needs to happen in order to do this in a good way.
Turns out, Canada is actually ahead of the curve on this.
What I've learned in the most is just how advanced we are in Canada compared to the rest of the world.
Ken circles back on that idea, because sometimes a point is worth hearing twice.
And secondly, that a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in Canada are very similar across nation states around the world. Whereas there's this interest in Indigenous knowledge systems, there's Indigenous, including Indigenous peoples, but there's difficulty integrating or participating in modern science for a number of reasons. Some of it is like inadequate funding. Some of it is lack of equipment and resources in regions such as like wharfs and boats. Some of it is some of the Indigenous peoples were not given legal recognition in some of their nation states. But regardless of all of these troubles that we're dealing with, the nations are still very strong in the knowledges that they have and the methodologies that they have, and they're all rooted in culture.
Too many decisions still get made in offices far from the coast. Ken shows what changes when lived experience is part of the process from the start.
But overall, like if we can help adapt better tools so that we have better information, hopefully that'll allow those that are making decisions on behalf of, the federal government or the IMO or some of these other like national, international organizations, that they'll make better decisions rather than, make a decision in a boardroom with not good information that will have devastating effects when they apply it.
We talk a lot about new data these days, but for Peter, the record goes way back, long before satellites or sensors.
Well, with the new data, what's new is the instrumentation and the numbers and the tech. But the data has always been coming through these Indigenous communities since millennia. They've had to have some engineering and science skills in building their longhouses to their boats and then to the sustainable monitoring they were able to keep for thousands of years. I always say, Indigenous have been on the front lines of ocean observation for thousands of years. Who better knows the climate than the Indigenous. They know the changes in the species firsthand. The changes in the shoreline. They've seen fluctuations in trends.
So why not share the tech? Community get tools to monitor their own waters, and scientists get better data. Win-win.
When I said we're on the front lines, we know the changes in the species. We know the fluctuations, the threads that are happening. So when we talk about big tech too, it's like supporting Indigenous nations. Is that why not give them the tech? That also helps save costs for scientists. That works for their own data, their own initiatives to inform their own leaders properly on what's happening in the ocean. A lot of times we're interested in the same type of data, same type of science, but building that like relationship where there could be a sharing of tech. So for example, ONC many moons ago, we had done a polar study with sea ice melt with the Inuit, and the Inuit knowledgers will let us know what's happening, the fluctuations in the sea ice. We put monitors into the sea ice. They would go gather it up. They would let us know what was happening. But there's a study there that we both have concerns about and that we agree on. But given the people who are right on the front lines, the tech is something that works for all of us and works for climate change.
Data is fine, but stories? That's where the ocean gets personal. Ever notice how science likes straight lines and numbers? Ceremonies don't. They remind us the ocean is also about meaning.
Well, I've been fortunate to be invited to participate in numerous ceremonies, and I go into these things with humility because I'm there to learn. It's an honor to be asked. And I had an elder explain to me that when he dies, he wants his body buried in the ground so that the worms and all of the other insects will naturally decompose it. Those species could be eaten by birds. They will grow grasses and trees that might feed other insects, other kinds of species, and those other might be predated upon by others. And so our DNA is literally within the soils and waters of our home territories, because this is what the ancestors do.
Interestingly, Ken has shared with us some similar stories of honoring the nature.
Most of the nations I have worked with, they will actually do honoring of the species which they're going to fish or they're going to hunt before they go out. And that's the thing that we carry in our nation as well. It's kind of like this understanding of the relationship and honoring the spirit, because we're asking these animals to provide for us. But at the same time, we want to do it responsibly so that we have continuous, fish species coming into our rivers for not only for us, like tomorrow, but for the future generations.
Now shift scenes. Childhood at sea, whales at the bow, dolphins at night. That's where love for ocean begins.
And so the ocean was in my blood. Commercial fishing on the west coast of Cape Scott on Vancouver Island, between Cape Scott and Brooks Peninsula, every summer was my playground. And, I would find things on the beach when we had time in the harbors and bays and make rafts and play on the beach. So while all my friends went to camp or splashdown park, I went to learn how to run a commercial fishing business with my father and would witness amazing things out there every summer. And every time we arrived, this couple of humpback whales would greet the boat. And we always get greeted in Charlotte Sound, just outside of Santula, on our way up to the fishing grounds by thousands of dolphins. But I would just hang on the side of the boat, and I could almost touch them, and they'd be twirling, and you would take turns to look at me, and I would do this until I fell asleep. And my dad would put a blanket on me, and I would wake up as my dad's about to anchor somewhere. And I just became one with the ocean as a child, of learning the ropes, how to motor around and what it took to commercial fish. I always grew up around storytellers. I grew up around fishermen, always having a good BS, as they would say. And so I heard all kinds of amazing, colorful stories and about sailors at sea, witnessing unbelievable things, supernatural things even. And I met a lot of really interesting characters. But we always joke as Indigenous, we always say, sitting on our porch or something, watching scientists dig around in territory without permission. Never came to the offices, never let us know ahead of time. They're digging around in a certain area. Should we tell them? Should we tell them they're not in the right and on a good spot? That's not where what they're looking for is, or no, don't tell them. And they lose thousands, sometimes millions of dollars for not consulting properly. But if you would have asked, I could have just told you it's just right over there. And we would have worked with you. We would have had guides, we had boats, we would have had accommodation even for you guys. We could have told you the whole history and the trends we've seen over the years, with that. But you never asked, or you never, we already had done data on it.
And yes, sometimes the best data point is just knocking on the right door or porch. Want to know what real field training looks like? Forget labs. Try Arctic ice, one candle, and an elder as your guide.
When I did a 3-year project with 3 communities in Nunavut about changes to sea ice and how these changes to sea ice are affecting life in community and culture and ways of life. And one of the aspects of that project was to go and do field work on the ice with local guides. So I was out on the ice with an elder from Cambridge Bay, and he was telling us this story about, well, actually, maybe I should describe this too. So I'm with a bunch of scientists there's me, and then there's a graduate student, and then there's a government scientist. And we're all decked out in about $2,000 worth of gear. This was in November, sorry. So it was quite cold. So we're all, we've got this and this specialized equipment from head to toe, right? And anyway, so he starts telling us this story, actually asks us if we know how to survive a night on the ice. And we're like, biting our nails kind of thing. And then he tells us how he can survive with just a candle, because he knows how to look at the clouds to find the place where there's going to be the right kind of snow and ice to build a shelter. And then he knows how to build that shelter in a way that's going to keep him warm. And then he can use the candle for heat and light and survive. And this isn't, something he made up. This is actually something that he's done, right? And so I think, that kind of understanding of the environment and wisdom and knowledge, that's something that I, as a scientist, will never acquire and shouldn't either. I can tell you how to look up some references in the library really well, but can I survive a night on the ice with a candle? No, I cannot, right? And so, that's a kind of dramatic example, but I remember at that moment thinking this is really what these different knowledge systems are all about, that people hold expertise that we just need to learn from and understand that these are complementary knowledge systems that have more strength when we bring them together than when we look at them by themselves.
These stories remind us the ocean is lived as much as it's studied. And if it's true for today, just imagine what it means for the ones growing up with it tomorrow. So if the ocean is lived as much as it's studied, who carries it next? Let's hear from Ken. He's been putting youth right on deck where the learning gets real.
I'm also involved with a major project up in Newfoundland with the Mi'kmaq First Nation, and we're on top of, they own a ship with Horizon Maritime that used to be a Coast Guard icebreaker that was built in the 50s. They've owned it now for, I think, 6 years. And they had leased it out for the first 4 years just to anybody who needed a research vessel. But 2 years ago, they started a program where we're doing science work with primarily with DFO and the Marine Institute, but we have other partners like ONC. They've been on board last year and they're coming on board this year. The Audubon Society, the Canadian Geographical Society, the Pew Foundation, and Parks Canada. And what we're doing there is, as the science is taking place, whether it's looking at deep sea corals with underwater cameras, bottom grabs for looking for plankton and other living specimens in the mud, doing water sampling. We bring the youth on board onto the deck to help with this, to expose them to these different activities. And when the ship is on downtime, we actually have the scientists on board to prepare a lecture, like maybe an hour, 2 hours in one afternoon. We'll have them talk about deep sea corals and what that's all about. Or somebody else will come and talk about like why we observe seabirds and things like that. So we're trying to stimulate their imagination. We want to have more of our youth expand their ocean reach.
Feels different, doesn't it? Science stops being a lecture and becomes an adventure. Peter knows that lesson too, straight from the ocean itself.
You really have to face yourself when you're in the ocean for long periods of time, and you have to get over that. You have to really become one with the ocean. If you're not one with the ocean will eat you up. If you don't respect the ocean will swallow you up. And you kind of wind up talking to the ocean in a way. It's kind of become a meditation. It teaches you a lot about patience and teaches you about discipline. You don't know where your tool is and the boat's sinking. How are you going to fix it? So you learn right away where to put the tools back where they belong, and start learning about numbers and running a business and survival. And
not everyone gets that kind of crash course, but ONC's been giving young people their own version, hands-on, shoulder to shoulder with scientists. Picture this, young people on the deck of a ship, pulling samples from the deep, listening to scientists describe the hidden life of corals and seabirds. For many, it's the first time they see the ocean, not just as livelihood, but as a field of endless possibilities. And it inspires the next generations as well. Peter's seen it in action, when communities lead and science follow.
And then just another example of some of the successes, we did a tsunami risk assessment project on the Northwest Coast. All the knowledge holders shared all the history of tsunamis as far back as 1700. We got that all into research. We shared that research back. And actually we ended up getting some extra funding for that tsunami risk assessment project to do a documentary. That was a way of giving back as well, back to all the communities, screened all the communities, shared with them. And so they have their elders on video in that documentary, as well as all the transcripts. But what we also, when the community let us know how a tsunami interacted, in 1700, and through their legends and their history and their stories, which communities were wiped out, we got to understand the boots on the ground scenario, which really complemented our data and which allowed for us to understand that our data was on track from what the community and the history was telling us, and then up to as early as 1964 or the last Chilean surge that hit our coast. So that knowledge that was shared, that project would have been flat if it didn't have actually the rich, colorful knowledge and the stories. We would just be going off our data, and we won't actually have prime examples or stories that, this wave actually turned here. That's how it interacted with this community. It bypassed this community. But that project was an example of Indigenous knowledge systems working with Western science per se, where we were flying over with LiDAR, crunching data into numbers, but it allowed us to know that we were on track.
Stories like these don't just preserve the past, they shape how the next generation will face the future. The recipe is simple. Youth stepping in, elders guiding, communities setting priorities. Data and tradition, side by side. And did you catch that shift? People in places before profit. That's not just a model, it's a mindset. One built for the long run, for the generations yet to come. Partnerships aren't just about today's good vibe. They're about tomorrow, when climate change, fisheries, and the ocean's health come knocking. Peter's clear on this. Skip the early conversation and you're in trouble. Let's hear him.
I haven't come across too many challenges at ONC, just because we start that conversation early. That's what I encourage other ocean scientists to do is, where they run into problems is that communication is not started early and they think they could just fly into a community and start digging around. That's where you'll end up in big trouble. And what they perceive as consultation is normally not. And it takes time. It could take up to a year to properly engage with a community. And the healthy ones are the ones that write the proposal together. So they know those expectations. I was approached by this Dutch scientist, and he said, my colleagues, and I'm starting to warm up, and I've been hearing you, and my colleagues really don't want to work with Indigenous. What do I say to them? And I just say, it's simple. You like long-term data? You want to be invited back? Well, you got to start on the right foot. Otherwise, your data is going to be incomplete. And sometimes you got to put it in numbers for people to understand, unfortunately. But it really comes down to mutual respect for one another as human beings. It's really that simple. The way people talk about sometimes Indigenous is like we're not even human, and a lot of the cases I have to deal with is like how to deal with an Indian, and it gets tiring after a while, but it keeps me busy. And it keeps Ken and I advocating around the world for Indigenous and realizing, there's still a lot of work to be done. But, we've seen some change. We've seen some movement. We see more conferences echoing a lot of the work that Ken and ONC has done. They're starting to lead their own initiatives and be very respectful, have more space for Indigenous. A lot of times space is taken up by Indigenous experts, as opposed to actually having the Indigenous present themselves. In Canada, we've had a very healthy guardianship. As far back 1,000 years, we had guardian watchmen, and from east and west, it varies in how that guardianship works. But we've been managing our own fisheries. We've been sustaining, for so long and have so much experience sustaining. But, really, it's just amazing. Like there's, Indigenous like to do are into business, or they actually have biologists. Like, oh, wow. That still comes up worldwide, but in Canada, we got a long way to go, but we still are leading Indigenous engagement. We're trying to get to that point where we're not leading anymore and, the world is on point. But sometimes it's as simple as tell me a story, tell me who you are before you do anything. But, and there's sometimes government policies that make it hard for scientists to work with Indigenous, and that's got to change. There's funding apparatuses that are out of date, and they have deadlines that don't work well with nations. That needs to change, because a lot of those funding apparatuses kind of makes one party dictating to another, and that doesn't work for our people. So I've definitely seen a lot of growth in Indigenous partnerships. Hopefully it continues.
See the pattern? It's not rocket science, it's respect. And still, plenty of people don't get it. Ken meets them every day.
There are segments of our society that no matter what you tell them, they've already kind of set in their ways, right? There are other segments of our society that they may not know how to work with Indigenous communities, but they are trying to figure out how to do it. And then some people in the middle that could be educated, like they're open to learning. And so first of all, I kind of assess like where people are at. Like if they want to learn, I'm very happy to share with them. But if they're just trying to formulate counter arguments, like to me, that's not a healthy use of my time and my energy. I try to look for the people that are open to doing this kind of work with their communities. That's my personal aspect. And I only really feed enough information that they can understand. Like we can't really always talk about the entire history of what's been going on. Like why are Native people put on reserves, tenure reserves, right? And this is kind of like there's still an active Indian Act in Canada, right? So, we are a systemically racist country. We're the only group that has a people that is being governed by a federal department. And putting us on reserves was a way of pulling us away from resources so that others could exploit. There's also still an epidemic against murdered and missing Indigenous women. So Indigenous women are are still being exploited. Sometimes they're being abused, and sometimes they go missing. They go murdered. We have overpopulations within our prison systems. And that's not to say that Native people are like bad or criminals. It's just that the systems are stacked against us. We had laws preventing us from practicing our cultures. We had laws against us having fair representation in courts. But despite all of these different things, the strength of our communities really comes back to the culture and the family units within the communities themselves. We still have governing nations. We still have that long-term vision. We honor our elders. We honor those kind of visions. And we try to take those visions from the elders and try to make them usable and workable in today's environment. We're not peoples that live in the past. We have been adapting. We are going to continue to adapt. We do need help with access to capital. Any work in the ocean sector costs money. There is a large disparity between what an Indigenous community has funding to do as opposed to what needs to be done. So one of the strong things, and this is some of the work that we've done with Ocean Networks Canada when we did this work for the Ocean Decade, the UN Decade for Ocean Sciences, is trying to advocate and try to figure out other funding mechanisms that are outside the federal system. Because if you have multiple funding systems and multiple funding partners, you have an opportunity to actually bring your community priorities forward. And if Indigenous communities are empowered to do the work that they know needs to be done, we will have a better chance at fighting climate change, fighting the shortages of fisheries, fighting soil erosion, and really having respect for the relationship we have with the ocean and with nature.
Respect isn't just a nice add-on. It decides whether partnerships last or collapse. And it's the same when money enters the mix. Because for Indigenous communities, the bottom line isn't just profit. It's people and places first. Ken explains.
In the business world, they also will talk about economic profits, economic sustainability. They'll talk about environmental sustainability and social sustainability. And those are the three legs to the concept of sustainable development. But when we talk about people, place, and profits, the reason why that's important is that if you're working specifically with an industry group or a business, they naturally have to look at profitability. That's really their bottom line. And they talk about value to shareholders. But when you work with Indigenous communities, and I've worked with like many of them, some of them are sort of economically minded, some of them are environmentally minded, and the rest are kind of in between. They will talk about people, places, and profits in that order. The first thing that they will, no matter who you talk to in the communities, they will talk about what is the benefit to community members if we engage in this project. The second thing that they'll talk about is what's the benefit to the long-term sustainability, because people will hear about the 7-generational thinking that many First Nations in Canada use. Not all of them, but many of them do. But they're thinking intergenerationally, like how will this impact the generations yet to come? Because the ancestors did all of the work so that we today could benefit from having a healthy environment, healthy fisheries, healthy natural resources. And in the future, we will be the ancestors. And we want to make sure that our descendants understand that we're working within the powers that we have to try to work towards a positive outcome for the generations yet to come. And then finally, they will talk about profits. Like Native people in general are not opposed to industry or not opposed to profit, because we understand we live in an economy that has to have monetary value.
Right.
But oftentimes they will forego the maximizing economic benefits if they feel there's going to be environmental harm. And like a simple example for this, like I have a friend who was in charge of the community fisheries, and they ran their lobster boats. And they knew that they could put 2 people on the lobster boats and make a profit for the band and make a profit for the individuals. But they purposely would put 3 people on the lobster boats to increase employment for individuals. So you're employing 3 people per boat rather than 2. Yep. Now, that's an economic hit, but it's a longer term benefit for community members to elevate all levels, all standards of living. So equal place and profits, and usually in that order.
Here's the point. When Indigenous wisdom and ONC science move together, resilience stops being an idea. It becomes real. That's the power of these partnerships, and Ken has lived it.
I got to work with some of the most amazing elders across the country, some of the most beautiful landscapes that Canada has to offer.
All right, let's look ahead. 10 years from now, what will these partnerships really mean? From elders' teachings to real-time sensors, from youth stepping on deck to leaders driving climate action, this is partnership, past and present, shaping the future.
Well, if we start on the right foot, a lot of those studies can continue. There are studies out there, maybe not always ONC related, but that continue to gain the funding because they started a 5-year proposal, then they got another 5 years per se, and going to 10 years. So that's a really healthy relationship. That's a healthy partnership. Both sides are working well together, but that's because they started from the ground up, as opposed to it coming abstractly in.
If we think about 10 years from now, like my hope would be that Ocean Networks Canada has found a way to share the resources that we have, being a university-affiliated national research facility, with communities, and that we have young people who've decided to pursue ocean science and are also bringing their cultural heritage and their knowledge as Indigenous youth to this work. And so, and in 10 years, they're going to be the ocean professionals, and they're going to be the leaders, and they're going to be leaders in their community.
I think like with the work that ONC is doing and this community-based approach, that you're going to see many more Indigenous peoples working in these ocean tech kind of world and helping to shape the technology, shape the kind of work that needs to be done. They will have true partnerships with more Western science types. We only have one planet, right? And if we're going into a program or to a project just to build ourselves up, like that's ego. We really have to look at what's in the best interests of the marine space, the ocean space, for the betterment of the planet, so that we will all benefit.
The ocean is vast. Its challenges are immense. But together, with trust, respect, and courage, we are stronger than the storms ahead. As we close this episode, a heartfelt thank you to our 3 guests, Maya Huberex, Peter Romer, and Ken Paul, for sharing their insights, their stories, and their vision for the future of our ocean. Their voices remind us of something profound. Indigenous knowledge is not only history, it is a living system guiding us towards balance, respect, and resilience. This podcast is produced by Balad'EAU with the generous support of Ocean Networks Canada. ONC is one of Canada's major research facilities and is an initiative of the University of Victoria. It is primarily funded by the Canadian Foundation for Innovation and by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. A special thank you goes to Tommy Goupil for editing and production, and to Andrew Lowen of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. If you'd like to hear the full interviews with our 3 fascinating guests, check out this podcast. For this special series, each episode is offered in 2 versions, the full interview with Andrew and a narrative episode, more storytelling style, here on Balad'EAU. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe, visit our website, and follow us on social media for updates. Your support helps us continue sharing these true stories of scientific discovery and human ingenuity. You'll find all the links in the episode description, along with information on how to visit, explore, and follow Ocean Networks Canada. This includes educational contents, news of their latest missions, and even live camera feeds from their observatories. That's a true treasure chest of daily discoveries. You will find all the links in the episode description, along with information on how to visit, explore, and follow Ocean Networks Canada. This includes educational content and news of their latest projects. I'll also add a link to something you won't want to miss: Tsunami Elephant Relative, a film Peter created with elders on the West Coast. It's the perfect example of what this episode is all about. Science and Indigenous knowledge working together. And trust me, it's a must-watch. I'm your host, Lynn Morissette. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep exploring the ocean, honoring its knowledge, and uncovering its secrets.